Hello, and thank you for joining me again. Today we're going to read the last chapter of Flat Stanley. So let's take a look at the questions. Number 1 for chapter 5, the question is, what was the further change Stanley had to deal with? So we know Stanley has changed drastically. He became flat when a bulletin board fell on top of him. What further change does he have to deal with in this chapter? Number 2, what did Arthur believe was Stanley's problem? Number 3, what made Stanley and Arthur become friends again? Number 4, what was Arthur's plan to help Stanley? Reading these questions makes me think that something maybe not positive is going to happen to Stanley that will help him connect with his brother because his brother's been having a hard time being jealous. Number 5, what did you think of this plan to help? Number 6, how did it work out for Stanley? And number 7, what did you think of the ending? How would you change the ending if possible? I would love it if you really gave that last question. How would you change the ending if you could? Some thought. I would love to hear your alternative ending. Okay, here we go. Chapter 5, Arthur's Good Idea. Finally, Arthur gets some credit. For a while, Stanley Lamb Chop was a famous name because remember how he caught the art thieves, right? The sneak thieves. Everywhere that Stanley went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, "Over there, Agnes, over there. That must be Stanley Lamb Chop, the one who caught the sneak thieves," and things like that. But after a few weeks, the whispering and the staring stopped. So here is Stanley walking around town. How would you describe his expression? Don't you think he looks really proud of himself? I think so too. He looks like a celebrity. Like, yes, you know me. You know who I am. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came a further change. That was one of our questions. And it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him. And as they passed by, "Hello, Super Skinny," they would shout. And even ruder things about the way that he looked. Stanley told his parents how he felt. "It's the other kids I mostly mind," he said. "They don't like me anymore because I'm different, because I'm flat." "Shame on them," Mrs. Lamb Chop said. "It's wrong to dislike people for their shapes, or their religion, or the color of their skin." "I know," Stanley said, "only maybe it's impossible for everyone to like everybody." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Lamb Chop, "but they can at least try." Later that night, Arthur Lamb Chop was woken by the sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room and he knelt by Stanley's bed. "Are you okay?" he said. "Go away," Stanley said. "Don't be mad at me," Arthur said. "You're still mad because I let you get tangled the day that you were my kite, I guess." "Skip it, will you?" Stanley said. "I'm not mad. Just go away." "Please, let's be friends." Arthur couldn't help crying a little too. "Oh, Stanley," he said, "please tell me what's wrong." Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. "The thing is," he said, "I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again like other people, but I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick." "Oh, Stanley," Arthur said. He dried his tears on the corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. "Don't talk about what I just said," Stanley told him. I don't want the folks to worry." I think that's slang in this story for the parents. "That would only make it worse." "You're brave," Arthur said. "You really are." He took hold of Stanley's hand, and the two brothers sat together in the darkness, being friends. They were both still sad, but each one felt a little better than he had before. And then suddenly, though he was not even trying to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and he turned on the light and he ran to the big storage box where toys and things were kept, and he began to rummage in the box. Stanley sat up in bed to watch. Arthur flung aside a football and some lead soldiers and an airplane model and lots of wooden blocks, and then he said, "Aha!" What do you think Arthur found? That will help Stanley. Let's find out. He found what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. I bet you know what he has in mind. He held it up and Stanley and he looked at each other. "Okay," Stanley said at last, "but take it easy." He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth, and he clamped his lips so tightly around it that no air could escape. "I'll go slowly," Arthur said. "If it hurts or anything, just wiggle your hand at me." He began to pump. At first, nothing happened except that Stanley's cheeks bulged a bit. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle signal, so he pumped on. Then suddenly, Stanley's top half began to swell. It's working, shouted Arthur, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get around in him more easily, and he got bigger and bigger, and the buttons of his pajama top burst off. Pop, pop, pop! A moment more, and he was all rounded out, head and body, arms and legs, but not his right foot. That foot stayed flat. Oh, no. Arthur stopped pumping. It's like trying to do the very bit of those long balloons, he said. Maybe a shake would help. There he is. Stanley shook his right foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one, and there stood Stanley Lambchop as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. "Thank you, Arthur," Stanley said. "Thank you very much." The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambchop strode into the room with Mrs. Lambchop right behind him. "We heard you," said Mr. Lambchop, "up and talking when you ought to be asleep. Shame on—" "George," said Mrs. Lambchop, "Stanley's round again." "You're right," said Mr. Lambchop, noticing. "Good for you, Stanley." "I'm the one who did it," Arthur said. "I blew him up." Everyone was terribly excited and happy, of course. Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion. There they are. It's a nice family. It's a nice family drawing. That looks pretty nice. And several, maybe chocolate chip cookies, toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When you say cheers, cheers. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them, and then they turned out the light. "Good night," they said. "Good night," said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long and tiring day. Very soon all the Lambchops were asleep. The end. And that's the end of Flat Stanley. Now, I would love to know how you would change the ending of this book. The bicycle pump was a good idea, but do you have a different idea of how the book could have ended? I would love to hear it. See you later.